thank everybody. I'm Melinda Gable with the Forest Landowners Foundation, and really appreciate you taking the time today. I know some of you might be missing a lab, or it's the end of the day after a lot of classes. Some of you are just coming off spring break. We appreciate you taking the time, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. But real quick before I do, if you are in and can turn your camera off just for a second so we can get a look at everybody, and everybody can put in there. Hey, Chase, good to have you come in from Auburn. Chase is one of our former Public Policy Institute students, so good to see you again, Chase. Let us know where you're from, what your major is, and then we'll get started on the session 1 of the 3-day Virtual Public Policy Institute. I am going to Michelle, let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get going.
You should be able to just hit the share at the bottom and be good to go.
Yeah, you have disabled it.
I'll try that now.
Excellent. All right. Well, as I said a minute ago, I want to welcome everybody to the Virtual Forest Policy Institute. We have actually, the Forest Landowners Association, we've been hosting this Forest Policy Institute for several years, but obviously with COVID, we haven't been able to do it in person. And this year we said, you know what, we're going to do a virtual one, and this way we can open it up and let as many people attend as possible. Usually it's a 3-day policy institute in Washington, D.C. that is a real deep dive into natural resource and forest policy. We started hosting this after a few years ago when we were meeting with deans of forestry schools, and a reemerging theme and conversation kept coming up, which was, as forests more and more were becoming in the spotlight as a solution to some of our major environmental issues, but also wood markets and other things, that students getting degrees in natural resources and forest degrees really didn't have that connection to how policies intersect with the forest into the larger picture. So we said, hey, we can really fill that gap by bringing these students to Washington, D.C. And so now we're really happy to offer this in a virtual format, and hopefully we'll continue the virtual format, but also get back in person next year in Washington, D.C. So, you know, whether you realize it or not, I don't know how many of you are seniors or juniors, but if you follow your career path into natural resources, whatever job you have, you will find that there's going to be a connection back to policies. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, is how these policies do connect back to the various areas and career paths that you might find yourself in a year from now, 5 years from now. Let me tell you a little bit about the Forest Landowner Association. We represent family forest landowners and private forest landowners. The majority of our members do own their land for selling into the wood markets for timber, whether they're a 100-acre landowner, a 500-acre landowner, or a 100,000-acre landowner. So the economic viability of the forest landowner is really important if we're going to sustain the forest. And so what we always say is, whether you care about drinking water, clean air, the economic benefits, if we're going to sustain these benefits, we need to really understand that role of the landowner and the importance of them being able to be sustained through harvesting timber, and how the two, the timber and the wood markets, can coexist and actually help benefit each other. So real quick, because we don't have 3 days in Washington, D.C., I'm going to give you a fast overview and some statistics just to bring your head into the perspective of policy and forest policy. So I don't know, maybe I'm a different generation. I know I'm a different generation than all of you here, but I just love, I'm just a Bill on Capitol Hill. If you don't know that song, Google it and watch it afterwards. But In the past two Congresses, so that's basically in the past 3.5 years, the number of bills that have been introduced that had the word forced in it have been 1,260. That's a lot of bills, a lot of pieces of legislation. Of all of those bills, though, however, to this point, only 44 have become law. So what happens between a bill being introduced and it becoming law is a lot of focus, a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of what you're going to hear about from the speakers over the next 3 days will kind of bring some crystallization to that. But when you look at those bills, those 1,200 bills, they get introduced either in the House or the Senate. And the first line of offense, if you will, moving these bills through are the congressional staffers. So if you look at the 435 members of Congress, there's 10,000 congressional staffers. Average age of these staffers is about 31. A lot of them come in right out of college, they stay in, and then they move on. But overall, 31. So if you take all that legislation that's introduced that revolves around policy, and you ask how many of those staffers have a forestry related degree, whether it be natural resource forestry related, fewer than 20. This was the stat about 4 years ago when I looked into this. So it's really important as we talk about forestry and natural resources and all the things you're learning, these staffers have a lot they've got to learn and figure out, does this bill advance and help what it's trying to advance and help? How does it impact my constituents? What is the full picture here? So not only do you have these staffers trying to figure that out, and they're super busy and working, everybody knows about lobbyists. Well, of those bills being introduced, and I'm just talking about the forestry ones, but of all the lobbyists, there's 12,137 registered lobbyists knocking on the door, sending emails, trying to influence those bills into becoming law. And they're spending a lot of money, 3.7 billion. So you might think, okay, well, the lobbyists take care of everything. It's the lobbyists that influence everything. But in reality, in a survey that was recently asked of congressional staff, if your boss had a conflict and there's two people asking for a meeting, who would you give the meeting to? Only 7% said they would give it to the lobbyists over the constituents. So the constituents are who the members of Congress work for. And it's really important that as a constituent, no matter where you are or what field you're in, that you're engaged and you understand, especially when it comes to forestry and your soon to be career. So engagement, you know, a lot happens in Washington, D.C., but it's when that member of Congress or the person who's working for the Forest Service is back home and talking one-on-one with the constituents. Here you see, this is with the white shirt and the yellow tie, that's Senator Tom Cotton. He's meeting with some of our members in Arkansas about some issues. And then to the right here, you have in the middle, you have Congressman Westerman, who, by the way, is the only forester in Congress with a forestry degree. We're going to have his staffer talking to us tomorrow, but he's sitting here talking to the Forest Service. So engagement really matters, and that's something I hope you'll walk away with after joining us today and for the next couple of sessions. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Ethan, who's our guest speaker today. Knowing that we could only meet for 3 hours instead of 3 days, we said, let's focus on a theme. And so the emergent theme with climate change and everything that's happening is really forest as a natural climate solution. And what does that mean for forest landowners? What does it mean for a wood market? And what does it mean to sustain the forest landscape? So I'm really excited you guys are all here to join us where the woods meets Washington. And with that, I'm going to have Ethan take over the screen, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and his organization, and we'll go from there.
Thanks. And I'm just going to talk with you all for a minute or two here before I throw up some content and some slides talking about some of the data behind forest as a natural climate solution, and talk through some of the reasons we have presented data in the way that I'm going to show you. But first, to follow the instructions, yes, my name is Ethan Breitling. I am the Creative and Communications Director for the National Alliance of Forest Owners. So NAFO, as we're called, not to be confused with NATO, which every once in a while we do get a random tweet where people yell at us about actions that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is or is not taking. But we are the National Alliance of Forest Owners. So we represent large private landowners, private forest owners. We have about 47 million acres represented in our membership. So that is, if all of our forests were in one spot, we would be larger than the state of Washington. So it's a huge chunk of land, and our forests are managed to produce, lumber and 5,000 other products, and now more and more carbon. So we'll be getting into some of that in a little bit. But what NAFO really does is we connect policymakers with data and information that they need, data, information, and analysis that they need to implement policy and to make policy decisions that make the most sense for working forests. So we start off our frame of reference for engaging forests and policy from a simple sentence. We say that healthy markets for forest products provide clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, and jobs. Everything we do flows from that. So today we're going to talk about the clean air part and carbon, but that simple sentence is really important. And so talking about simplicity in communications is one of the things that the FLA team has asked me to talk to you about today. So we've seen some great intel just now from Melinda in her opening slides about who the policymakers are. 31 years old, less than 20 of them have a forestry degree. There's something like 22,000 of them on the Hill. So those policymakers are our specific target audience. So it's not going to be relevant for everyone on this call, but a lot of the lessons that we've learned and that I'm happy to share with you today are going to be relevant for a lot of the work that you will be doing as soon-to-be forestry professionals. So whether you want to be a forester, if you want to work in natural resources planning, if you want to work in commodities, supply chain, whatever it may be, communication is critical. So I can't tell you how many times we've met with forestry professional scientists who are excited about a new finding or an improvement that could be made in forest management. But there's a barrier in between the science and those who need to hear about it. I'm not sure that there are more polar opposites than scientists and political science degrees. I saw all the majors coming in on the side of the screen here in the chat, and I'm a political science degree, very different. Spreadsheets, data, science, it scares me a lot. But what I do love to do is to find out what the scientists are saying, see what the policy implications are, and then distill what the key messages are and how that can influence policy. The same thing is going to happen with you throughout your careers. If you are, doing research and you are trying to communicate that research to a CEO who's probably coming from a financial background, you're going to have to change the way in which you would normally speak in order to connect with your target audience. So obviously, step one in all of this is identifying who your target audience is. It is a simple question, but it is something that most people overlook. They get excited about what they want to talk about and they just start talking. So I think step one in communications and forestry and policy, or whatever it is that you're going to be doing, is stopping and saying, hey, who are we actually trying to talk to? And then you're going to go through some discovery. So, what is important to your audience? From our standpoint, we're sitting here, I'm one block from the Capitol building right now. How many of these folks care more about jobs and inflation, or how many of them care more about climate change? How many of them have a paper mill that may have closed in their district? How many of them have any experience in forestry at all? These are questions that you need to know in this information that will help you be more effective. So finding out what is important to your audience. And then what does your audience know already? And what do they know that's correct? And what do they know that's wrong? I can't tell you how many times we've had conversations where people know things that are incorrect, We've had conversations where early on, a member of Congress, his staff, who shall remain unnamed, was explaining to us that, when you cut down a tree, that smoke that you see coming out of the stump, that's the carbon dioxide being released from the center of the earth. They don't do forestry. They don't know. It's not their fault. They're doing something completely different. So, what do they not know and what do they know? Helps you tailor your message and figure out where you need to enter the conversation. So what do they know? What do they know? Is it right or is it wrong? And then, so what are the barriers to understanding between you and them? So classic mistake that we've all seen, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, is just jargon. The alphabet soup of the forestry world is wild. I have in our meeting materials, we just had a meeting last week with some of our scientist folks, and in the back page of this paper, I've got 6 pages of acronyms right here, and we have a glossary to go through that. Avoiding that kind of stuff is just critically important to connecting in a meaningful way with your target audience. Your jargon, key concepts. Does our target audience understand what carbon sequestration is? Is our audience confusing carbon sequestration with carbon storage? So identifying what these barriers to understanding are, concepts, jargon, et cetera, is really important. And all of these things coming together help us to build relevance. So you can talk about what you want to talk about till you're blue in the face, but you are only one part of the communications happening there. The folks who are listening to you, it needs to be relevant to what they're saying. So that goes back to the beginning of what I was talking about, the identifying our audience. When we talk to members of Congress and their staff who are from rural districts, I'm not going to go in there and talk to them about putting solar panels on skyscrapers. It's just not relevant, right? Just a disconnect. So all of our communication that we have tried to build is based on relevance. So what I'm going to show you next to lay the groundwork here is the result of about a year-long effort from my staff, where we started engaging these conversations with policymakers, their staff, on climate change. So, I just told you the kind of the crazy example of the folks saying that, like, the steam coming out of a stump is carbon dioxide. That's an extreme example. So, but there's drastic lack of experience and knowledge that we found in our target audience. These are folks that that Melinda put up earlier. They're getting bombarded with $3.7 billion of targeted information every day. Their inbox, they're getting thousands of emails every single day on every topic under the sun. You name it, there's an interest group for it. So, we have this moment in time where climate change is one of the top conversations in this city, in the whole country, really. And we've got these forests that we're managing that are a pretty good climate solution, but we just need to figure out how to tell that story and how to get our target audience to understand what it is we're talking about. So we started brainstorming, what is the best way to deliver these complex, frankly, pretty boring data sets to our target audience. So we started pulling it together, and there's some trial and error. Does anyone here know how many million metric tons of carbon, U.S. forests sequester annually? It's a lot. But if I told you it's about 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon and gross sequestration every year, you could say to me, "Oh, Ethan, thanks, that's great." But it's like, you just told me exactly how much the moon weighs. Like, that piece of information may be correct, but it means nothing to me. Like, I don't understand how much the moon weighs. I'm sure someone knows at NASA. There's probably like a whole room of people that are just sitting around thinking of new ways to measure how much the moon weighs. But, like, that is not relevant to me. And for a policymaker who has just a handful of moments to consider what the position you're talking about is, what your opinion of that position is, and what you're trying to convince them of, there are precious seconds that we just don't have time to waste on talking about how much the moon weighs and why it's important. We have to show them a picture. We have to show them the data. We have to show them why it's important. So we started building, all right, so how do we visualize this data? How do we pull together a resource that could be a one-stop shop that someone could go through on their own time and explore this data in a way that they can understand, that they can relate to, that's written to the 31-year-old that is frankly going to be fun if possible. So we worked and we created this scrolling data visualization that's called forestcarbondataviz.org. I'll pull it up in a few seconds here, or a few minutes here. And we started telling that story and that narrative, and we started setting the table for the things that folks need to know in order to understand the basic concepts before we could actually even get into the policy asks. So, one of the things that NAFO is in favor of is we're in favor of funding FIA, the Forest Service Inventory and Analysis Program, at a higher level. So we want the Forest Service to have the resources to give everyone the data on our forests that they need. But if we can't even have a conversation about forests with a policymaker or their staff who's not dealing with forests, there's only one forester in Congress, our efforts are going to be wasted. So we created this tool, and with that, I'm going to start pulling up the slide deck that helps you walk through it. So that way I can show you all what it is I'm talking about. So give me 1 second here to share my screen. I know everyone's Zoom fatigued let me share my screen, but it's coming right here. And can we see this? Is everyone good? Can I get a yes?
Yep.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so there we go. So I'm going to start quickly with an overview of U.S. forests. So if you look at the land base of the United States, about 2.3 billion acres. And that's everything, everything that is USA land. That's also lakes, bodies of water, things like that. But if you look at that in forests, it's about 760 million acres of forests. And if you put all that in one spot, it's about 1/3 of the total land mass of the US. So 34% of the US is forests. Now, those forests are different, right? We have different forests across the country, regionally, ownership styles, management styles, they're drastic. For policymakers, we break them down into 4 categories. And this is what they look like here: public, private, non-working, and working. So if you look at them, here they are in proportion to one another. And if you look down to your bottom of your left-hand screen here, you can see that white outline is the size of Texas. So that's Texas, and you can see how large our forests are. So you see the bottom right-hand box here, private working forests. That's where NAFO lives. That's where our landowners are. It's where FLA's landowners are as well. So if you look at the private forests, 60% of forests are privately owned. This is a shock to most people who are unfamiliar with forests. They assume that everything is a national park or everything is public land. So that is right off the top, that's something that surprises most people. And then of those working forests, 70% of working forests are on private land. So 2 things that shock most people. But then if we look at the harvests of everyone that we constantly are running into this as well, is that most folks think, hey, you're harvesting, tons of land each year. It's actually less than 2% of the total land base. And if you look at what's replanted every year, it's equal. Now, it's not the same acres, but it's, sometimes it lags depending on planting conditions, but every year we're replanting the same area that's harvested each year. Something that's very different in other parts of the world. So of that harvest, private working forests, which are the bottom right hand, are providing 90% of the wood and fiber for all forest products in the United States. Pretty big number. So 90% of the harvest, 90% of the wood is coming from private working forests. Now, what are we making from the wood that we're pulling out of the woods? You can see here a breakdown of harvest volume. And these are organized from top to bottom. The top is essentially the most valuable, bottom is the least valuable. So if you're a private forest owner, like those that NAFO represents, you're managing your land for lumber. That's pretty much it. You want to, tall, sturdy, straight trees. That's what you're shooting for. So that's what's driving most of your management decision. However, as a mature industry, forestry in the United States, margins are very important. So every single one of these markets is critical to the success of keeping forests as forests by keeping forest land valuable and producing economic output. So that's our quick overview of forests. Now that we've set that table, now let's talk about forest carbon. We're going to talk about this using three key things here. We're going to talk about a unitized carbon block. So often all of this data is in different repositories, spreadsheets, different government agencies. It's in different metrics, it's in different units, and we're pulling everything into a common language using our little square there that you see. We're also going to show relationships. So there's relational structures in this data visualization. And then the last point to know is that almost everything in this is public data from the government, except for one or two small spots, which I could point out. All right, so here we go. This is our unit of carbon, 10 million metric tons. That's our square. That's going to be our common language throughout this, this section of the presentation. So each square represents about 2.1 million cars off the road. So if we pull that out and we look at it in the broader the broader picture of the United States, this is the emissions of the United States. It's about 6.6 billion metric tons of carbon each year. CO2e, for those of you unfamiliar, is carbon dioxide equivalence, which is a common unit for all greenhouse gases, where you can take the multitude of greenhouse gases and convert them into a common, what is the impact on the atmosphere in terms of CO2. So that's what the CO2e is. And I can answer questions on that later if there are any. So we've seen the US emissions. Now, each year, growing trees sequester 1.5 billion metric tons of CO2. Now that's what you can see here on your, in the green on the left. So what does that look like if we break it down by the categories that we just learned about? The left-hand side here, that's what we want to show. The private working forests, if you overlay that over the emissions of the United States, the industrial emissions, you can see that it's larger than the total annual emissions from passenger vehicles in the United States. That is a lot of carbon. And keep in mind, that's just the private working forests on the left-hand side there. So there are other emissions that are related to forests, which you can see here. We've got the forest sector emissions, about 4.2 million metric tons, and then emissions from forest product manufacturing facilities, about 76. The 4.2 here is like our chainsaws in the woods, or our trucks in the woods, things like that. Now, there are other emissions, some biogenic emissions that aren't counted as industrial emissions, and I can answer questions on that later, but I know you're probably wondering, hey, what about wildfires, and what about biomass combustion? So those aren't counted in the 6.6 billion metric tons that are our industrial emissions. Those are accounted for in LULUCF, jargon, land use change, and forestry. So that's like the land-based biogenic emissions. And so that is shown here for perspective. You can see wildfires is about 142 million metric tons. That's from the EPA. And then the emissions from biomass combustion is about 366 million metric tons. So this is just sequestration that we've been talking about so far. But each year, sequestration is deposited into storage like a savings account, right? So storage is what's in the wood, in the tree, in the soil, in the carbon that's stored in roots, rocks, everything that's in the forest, the leaves, the twigs, the branches. So annually, we're pulling in a sequestration rate. So that 1.5 billion number that I showed you earlier, which was all forests, then you can see it here broken up into the 4 categories. That's getting added to the storage that is currently existing. And that's 150 billion metric tons of carbon. So if we look at that, it's so large, you can't actually fit it on screen. So this is about right here. So I skipped ahead a little bit. So that huge columns, those huge columns of storage are equal to about 85 years worth of energy production, industrial emissions. So all the power plants, 85 years worth of US power plant emissions are stored in our forests right now. So I talked before about the some of the emissions associated with forestry, biogenic emissions, biomass, wildfires. So there are complicated ways of computing and measuring the carbon stock change is what it's called. But so you're saying, okay, Ethan, you showed me the gross number. You showed me what the trees are sucking out of the atmosphere. That's 1.5 billion metric tons. But what is it after all of the math is done? And so at the end of the day, in 1 year, in 2018, we pulled 782 million metric tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's how much our storage grew by. So now I know you're probably thinking, but what about all the harvests that are happening? That are keeping our working forests working? So each year, about 100 million metric tons of new forest products are minted in the United States and are added to the wood product storage pool. So, and that storage pool is almost 10 billion metric tons. So that's the huge field of squares you see here. That's the amount of wood products that are currently in existence. So that's things like the table that my computer is sitting on right now. That is the wood in the wall behind me. A lot of homes, majority of his homes, there are furniture, every single wood product that you can imagine. There are calculations for like a half-life. So, you know, like a sheet of paper only counts for like 6 months, right? So that gets added into it. There's nationwide EPA experts that calculate how much wood is still in circulation before it gets transferred into landfills or, you know, waste sites. So that's what this is. This is wood that is currently in use. So when you add that together with the carbon storage that is held in all the 4 forest types that we've already learned about, you can see that there is a huge opportunity for forests as a natural climate solution, and specifically for private working forests, because we can see through what we've just learned, private working forests are providing 90% of the wood and fiber for our wood products. They're also storing about 54% of all the carbon. Remember those huge columns we saw? The private working forest column on the left, the largest one, is storing more than all the other forest types combined. And the gross annual sequestration, it's about 75% of all the new carbon that's getting pulled out of the atmosphere by the forests in the United States. That's happening on private working forest land. Got a huge story to tell here. And with level setting it, with this data visualization, we're able to have more impactful conversations. Now, I've just given you the PowerPoint version of this data visualization. There is a scrolling interactive version at forestcarbondataviz.org, and I encourage all of you to look at. Now, I will say it works better on a laptop than it does on a mobile screen because it's just so large. The data, it just works better if you're at a desktop or a laptop. So highly recommend checking that out. If you have questions, go in there. Also, you'll note while you're looking through forestcarbondataviz.org, every single data point is linked and backed up with a citation. And it will be, if you see there, right there, there's a green text right there. You click on any of the green text, it'll open up a panel from the side. It'll show you exactly where the data is coming from. And in normal, non-scientific language, will describe what's happening, why it's happening, what's the background, you know, are there other data points that you might see here? You know, there are a whole bunch of different data points that you might see about what is the total carbon sequestration. The citations panel will explain the differences between those, why certain groups use certain ones, who's calculating it, where you can find this table in the 700-page report from the EPA. It'll all open up automatically like that. So we've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. And there are also, like, there's a Rickroll, there's Bigfoot hidden in there. So, you know, have fun looking through that. And so with that, I'm happy to start with some questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I would love to answer any questions about either communicating complex forest carbon data, communicating about policy, or any of the content that I just put on screen, because I'm sure as forestry students, you'll be excited to learn about some of the data there and why we portrayed things in certain ways and where we get it from.
Yeah, and if I can ask everyone to come off, you know, take your camera, put your cameras on and come on and let's join the conversation together.
Yeah, Ethan, Thank you so much for that presentation. I've seen that tool a couple of times, and every time I look at it, it just blows my mind all over again, especially seeing that carbon storage in private working forests. Just, you have to scroll the screen. That's crazy. But yeah, so I just wanted to kick off the Q&A section, introduce myself, and then, get us going. So my name's Katie Moss. I'm the Government Affairs Coordinator for FLA. I graduated from Mississippi State University in 2018. So to all the students on here, I was in your shoes not too long ago. Joined the FLA team in 2020. And yeah, I love it. But so just to talk a little bit about how we'll do the Q&A section. So if you have a question, if you could use the raise hand function, and we'll ask you to come off mute and share your video if you aren't, if you're comfortable with that, and you can ask your question. You can also, of course, use the chat feature, and we will get to those questions after we have gone through all of the raised hands. So I'll go ahead and kick us off with the first question. So Ethan, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the feedback that you've gotten as you have shown this tool to other people? I know that I think y'all have won an award for this. So just, yeah, love to hear more about what other people think about this tool.
Yeah, great question. So essentially there's two buckets of feedback. There's, I didn't know that. And then there's, oh, what'd be really cool is if you added this. So those are the two buckets. Yeah, so, it's the big question that's still, lingering out there is people want to know more about forest products and wood products storage. So we're actually working together with a partner organization called the American Wood Council, which I know the FLA team is familiar with. And we are in the early stages of expanding this to another version 2.0 that will include more information on forest products, wood products, how they're used, how substituting steel and concrete for wood products can be beneficial when you're looking at the broad picture, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, things like that. So that's coming. So that is really the biggest feedback that we get, is that we'd like more of this. So I guess that's a good problem to have. Yes, we did win an award for this, which we're pretty excited about. If you're familiar, the Webbies, which are the Emmy Awards of the internet. They created a new program of awards for mission-driven work. And so, yeah, this was awarded for best strategy in climate, sustainability, and environment, I think. So yeah, it was pretty great. We're really excited about that, really proud of it. But the other feedback that we did get, and I guess it's important to note, and this is, just amongst us friends and educators here, we didn't get this 100% correct when we first launched it. We had to do a little bit of a rewrite. And in addition, we had inadvertently portrayed the difference between gross sequestration, which is, okay, in a single year, trees pulled this much carbon dioxide. A growing tree grew by this much. It pulled this much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? And we inadvertently overstated that and didn't include the net sequestration. It's, okay, we know that we're pulling this much carbon out of the atmosphere each year, but at the end of the day, after you factor in harvests, wildfires, mortality, decay, what's the actual, what's the profit, And so we had to rework some of it, and we had to relaunch it after about 2 weeks after we did some edits. And that's really important because, we want to be credible, and we tried, all of this data is from the federal government. It's not, not us. And so we're really, we wanted to have radical transparency. If you open up our citations panel on the top, it says, we're embracing radical transparency. We're showing you all of the receipts. You want them? We got receipts. So we reworked some of it, and that's important. As you're going through your career, through your research, revising is not a bad thing. Getting closer to the truth and getting closer to a more perfect product is a good thing, and we've done that, and we'll continue to improve on this. We have collected every single piece of feedback. I jokingly said about 2 buckets. There's some other random things that we get throughout the, throughout the day. We have a feedback email open, and we catalog every single bit because we will update this in the future, and it will be a living, breathing project.
Let's see. I see Courtney has her hand up. So if you want to unmute and ask your question, Courtney.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. My school, I'm a teacher and they set me up with this new system and it's like, I don't know if it works. Okay, but apparently it does. So that's good.
Great.
So this is like national level, right? Like,
yep.
You see this moving to like a state by state thing. So I'm in North Carolina, and I'm a PhD student starting in August. So graduated from UF, so it's okay to figure out there. But yeah, so our problem, we have a lot of problems in the state with people wanting to be more involved, I guess, that aren't already involved. So do you see this moving to like a state level sort of thing at some point in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is one of the, when I said people have said, can you do more? So there are different levels of availability for some of the data points that are presented at the state level. A majority of the Forest Service and EPA data prioritizes national reporting because the EPA and the Forest Service are tabulating their data to report it to the United Nations. That kind of sets, it's a top-down approach, right? So there are some data available at the state level. However, it quickly gets dicey. And we're currently working, I have an email open right behind all of you on my computer with the state of New York. The state of New York, they have more emissions data, so you can kind of do the compare and contrast better. And so we're working on trying to get that. However, like the wood products sink, for example, the EPA has a national number, but we don't have that for state. So like, and they're all done a little bit different. The EPA equivalent at the state level, a lot of them have different rules. So for example, in New York, they count not only the wood products that were in use, but the wood products that were created somewhere else and then moved into New York. And then Pennsylvania only counts wood products that were manufactured there. So if you split it out all to 50 states, you'll double count that cabinet that someone bought from Pennsylvania. Does that make sense? So like, there's all these weird nuances in the data. So one of the things that we're working on at NAFO is helping the Forest Products Lab, helping the FIA, which is the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, which is the Forest Service's forest data collection, MART, it's a huge program. It's the premier forest research and data program in the world, but there's room for improvement, and anyone who's involved will agree. So, we're working on trying to get them more funding so that they can do more and give us more data. And eventually, yes, we would love to have more granular data at the state level. And we are working with, we're NAFO, FLA. There's a NAFO and an FLA at each state, and so many of them are working with us there as they're trying to create their version of this. California is in the chute. New York is the first one out of the gate trying to create this.
Okay. Thank you.
And I see Jacqueline has her hand raised. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, so my question is, with the new carbon markets coming up and this like new information that we're gathering about carbon sequestration and working forests, does that mean landowners should be encouraged to manage their land for carbon, or should they continue to manage their land as they are for wood products? Because I feel like if you were to just do carbon, you'd be losing that sink of forest products and building with that instead of concrete and whatnot.
Yeah, great question. So I think the best answer, and you're gonna like, maybe you'll roll your eyes as like a typical Washington DC, slick politician answer, is I would say it's really up to the landowner and the market. So we believe in the integrity and improving the integrity of all carbon markets. Carbon markets are a good thing. Full stop there. So I think a private landowner and their management, I don't know if I could speak to a specific private landowner, right? But if I'm thinking at the macro level, if I'm thinking at a nationwide level, people are generally, they're rational actors, right? So folks are going to manage their land for where they can get a return. So, it is expensive to manage forest land, as many of you, I'm sure I don't have to preach into the choir on this call, right? It is expensive to manage forest land. And so if we can keep forest land profitable, and when we've seen that, 70% of the working forests are in private hands, if we see that 70% of the forests are in private hands and they need to remain profitable, or else, mom and pop who, are trying to keep their small working forests alive, and they're getting nickeled and dimed everywhere. Their margins are slim. Do they have marginal land that maybe they didn't have working before, but hey, we could plant some trees here and maybe we can enroll this in a carbon market? I think that's a good thing, and I think the market will be the truth serum there, right? So it doesn't really matter what I think or what we think, but I think that people are rational actors. Carbon is a good thing. Carbon markets are a good thing. And if they're set up properly and there's integrity, I think that the forest land management decisions will follow the value, because humans are rational economic actors, knock on wood, most of the time, right?
Yeah, Ethan, and I think I can add to that, if you go back to if a landowner is trying to choose how to manage their land for the economic return, part of this whole carbon sequestration discussion and the realization of the value of timber growers, if you will, in the wood markets is also the component of the built environment. So NAFO and FLA, and there's a lot of conversation around USDA and policymakers about how can we ensure that timber growers can keep growing and contributing and maybe get credits for the built environment. And that means when they do cut the tree, okay, what is the carbon that's stored in that tree that then goes to the builder? And so that's a whole different component when you think of the built environment and building with wood and mass timber.
Yeah, there are some folks that think that when you harvest a tree that you do it with a lightsaber and it just immediately becomes an emission. That's not true. I'm not a scientist, but I know that there's this thing called the conservation of mass or whatever, and physics exists. And so that carbon that's in that tree is going to remain in the wood that it's in, it's not going straight to the atmosphere. One of the other things that's important here too is that it's in the full presentation, but not in the abridged version I gave you today, is to look back at the historical trends. Since the 1950s, we're growing 60% more wood in the United States than we had before. And forest acreage has been stable, more or less. It's gone up and down a little bit, but forest acreage in the United States has been stable. Modern forestry has come a long way, and today we're doing pretty well. We've got more trees growing, and we have, pretty good, stable forest acreage. So, if you look at the data, it's a pretty good story to tell. And that's happening at a time, since the 1950s, the greatest economic expansion in the history of humanity occurred in this country. While that was going on, the stresses on the forest, the demand, unprecedented in human time. So, management in the United States is clearly doing something right if we can keep those numbers up.
I don't see any more hands raised yet, but while y'all are thinking of maybe some more questions, Ethan, I have another question for you.
Yeah.
So I know that you talked about expanding this into the Carbon Data Viz tool into forest products, but is something maybe on the table to potentially make another data visualization tool for other benefits that come from private working forests? So, wildlife habitat, clean water. I can see a tool like this being really helpful for a variety of the benefits that private forests provide.
Yeah, I definitely think that we'll be continuing to build our library. I think water and wildlife are going to be shortly behind what we're working on with the built environment. You know, if we recently have, we're working on another project that's we're not really visualizing here, but using the SFI program, the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, which is a third-party forest certification system for forest management. You know, we've worked with them and CASI, which is a think tank and research institution that works to improve forest management in the United States and Canada. And there are, our NAFO members are conserving. It's something like 200,000 miles of streams and rivers. I forget the exact number. I have it a spreadsheet here somewhere. 200,000 miles of streams and rivers. And if that would like circle the earth, how many times? So yeah, we've got some other work to do here. And I think the big lesson that we're learning is that visual storytelling is impactful. It's important, and it is advancing common understanding with our target audience to the point where we can have more meaningful and impactful conversations. And that's in our line of work, where we're in a war for attention span. That's gold. It's a nuclear weapon.
I see that Jace has his hand raised. Did I say that right?
Yes, ma'am, you did. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, Jace, how's it going?
It's going good. Ethan, great presentation. As a forester, I had a question. Talking outside of landowners, more so to the general public, how do we portray harvesting these private lands as a positive thing for the climate, when I feel like a lot of times it kind of gets like a negative rap when you see land that's clear cut and it's not looking good for the climate?
Right. It's like everybody loves a cheeseburger, but no one wants to go to a slaughterhouse, right? And you can see a clear cut from the side of the road, right? It's like driving by a slaughterhouse. No one's going to want to order McDonald's afterwards, right? Yeah, totally understand what you're saying. So the way we talk about harvests is we always talk about harvest in it's a cycle. It's growing, harvesting, and replanting. And we start with growing. We always say growing, harvesting, and replanting. In the United States, modern forestry, it is a continuous cycle, because we replant what we harvest. And the proof is in the pudding. You can look at the data, you can look at the Forest Service data, and you can see that we're doing well. We're keeping our forests healthy, and we're maintaining forest cover. And then I think one of the other ways that we talk about it positively is that we harvest where we planted, right? And so when you can frame it that way, and folks don't, they immediately think you want to clear cut Yosemite, right? That's what people think when they think of working forests, and that's just not the case. And so when you start the conversation with, harvests are important, and we do them, yeah, but we grow, we harvest, we replant. It's a continuing cycle, and we're harvesting where we planted. Those are messages that we use, and of course, trees and people get very emotional, and as they should. Everyone has a connection to the forest. And so we don't discount, the emotions that people have and the connection that they have. But when you talk about, in a rational manner, and you explain, the science and the reasoning, you can connect with folks, and we keep it in that cyclical discussion, and that seems to be working.
Thank you very much for answering that.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question.
All right, Katie. Well, I think we're coming up on 5 o'clock. So thank you, everyone. I hope you got a lot out of this, and you can always email us if you have further questions. Definitely visit the NAFO Carbon Viz site. I think you'll enjoy the messaging and the way you can tell that they are targeting the audience to the congressional staff of the younger generation. We will be back here tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. We have a congressional staffer who is on the House Natural Resources Committee. So he's going to talk to us about what it's like to be within Congress and be one of those 10,000 staffers. So it should be very interesting and a different perspective than what we heard from today. So everybody have a great night, get to your labs, and we'll see you back here tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you, Ethan, for coming and joining us today.